Okay, we are recording. I checked within the first hour, and we are in fact recording. So, hello and welcome to episode 111 of Question and Answer. I am your host, Panyo Basa, and I'm having a bad hair day. But it's not quite bad enough that I'm just not doing the video today. So, here I am. Here's the beverage with the little paper umbrella, which I hereby remove. Emergency backup beverage. And I suppose we should commence to answering questions. And I didn't count how many questions there are this time, so I'm not exactly sure whether this is going to be 2 hours or 3 hours. But we're just going to do what we do here. And let's just commence to answering questions. I suppose I should have turned the camera a little more so you can admire with awe and wonder my aquarium. Let's do that a little bit. Okay. So, first question is from Quick Quiz. And Quick Quiz says, what if Bhikkhu pets his puppy once a month and never tells confess to other monks? Since it's not parajika, technically, he still is Bhikkhu, right? Yeah, I assume when he refers to petting his puppy, he's referring to full out spanking his puppy. So, yeah, I mean, this is with regard to autoeroticism, so to speak. And so if a monk deliberately causes himself to have a sexual climax, then that is Sangha Sesa, which is the second most serious level of monastic offense. It's the worst thing you can do without getting excommunicated. So, I mean, petting the puppy, so long as you're not trying to have an orgasm, that's not even against the rules. So long as you're not trying to have an orgasm, even if it accidentally goes off, so long as you're not doing anything to help it along, anything like that on purpose, then you haven't broken a rule. But if you do it on purpose, then yeah, you are culpable, as they say in courtrooms or something. So if a bhikkhu masturbates, might as well just say it, and fully to orgasm, because it's the orgasm that's technically against the rules. If a monk, he's petting the puppy and with the intention of having an orgasm, and then just for whatever reason doesn't have one, that's still against the rules. It's a lesser rule, but the intention to have an orgasm has to be there in order to commit a serious offense. So let's say we got a monk who is spanking that puppy on a regular basis and never confesses. So what happens is he's still a monk because he hasn't done anything to excommunicate himself. If he actually had sex with another being, not even necessarily a woman, it could be a man, it could be an animal. If he has sexual intercourse, then yeah, he's out too, even if he doesn't have an orgasm. But let's see here. So he's still a monk. He's not excommunicated. He is technically a shameless monk. And he's going to be digging himself deeper and deeper into a hole, because to confess this kind of offense, a Sangha Sesa offense, you have to do penance for 6 days and 6 nights, plus however many days and nights you did not confess that offense when you had opportunities to do so. So it's like, if you are concealing that offense, you've done that, you're not telling anybody, even though you have opportunities to confess to another monk, then the penance you do is increased by the number of days that you do that. And if a monk is just doing this habitually for, let's say, a year or more, then eventually, if he does have a change of heart, he wants to set things straight, he wants to be a monk in good standing and all that, he wants to do penance for it, which you have to do, then he's going to have to do penance for more than a year. And it's really inconvenient, not only for him, but for the other monks at the monastery. like he's got to make confession to them on a daily basis. Or I guess if it's just for having concealed the offense, it might just be once a week. I don't remember exactly now. But he's got to keep track of all the monks coming and going to the monastery. If there's a lot of monks coming and going, he's going to have to move to a different monastery to do penance, just because you have to make confession to every monk who comes to that monastery. And if it's your day to make confession and you ask, where's Venerable so-and-so, it's like, oh, he took off on a trip, then that day doesn't count because you didn't make confession to him before he left. It's very inconvenient. It's really a pain in the neck. And just, especially for a serious monk, just the headache of having to do this penance for at least 6 days and 6 nights or longer if the offense is concealed, that's one of the main incentives not to break the rule. Because it is not easy. Like in Burma, there are certain monasteries that are generally remote forest monasteries that can specialize in monks doing penance. So monks will go there where there's not lots of monks coming and going. There's not like this huge sangha of lots of monks that you got to make confession to. It's easy to get them all together so you can make confession to them, that sort of thing. So, yeah, I mean, he's still a bhikkhu, but he's not technically a very good one. And if he ever decides to become a good one, he's going to have to make confession for each day, or he's going to have to do penance for each day that he concealed the offense, in addition to the 6 days and nights for having committed the offense in the first place. So, quick quiz's second question is as follows. What if bhikkhu lives alone in total solitude in the forest and no other monks around? How he can confess and purify himself? Well, I lived in that kind of situation a lot. Like when I was just living alone out in a forest somewhere, I could go for months without making confession to another monk. And especially considering that the few monks that did live in that area were very sloppy monks. And it's against the rules to confess a broken rule to a monk who has also broken that rule and not confessed it. So, yeah, I mean, if there's just not a convenient opportunity, then it's not against the rules. You're not really considered to be concealing it, and it's not like technically against the rules to do uposatha by yourself without having made confession because there's nobody nearby to make confession to. Or there might be monks nearby to make confession to, but they're just very lax monks. There's a very good chance you've broken at least one of the same rules that they break all the time. So that is sort of a loophole. It's an allowable reason for not making confession if you're in a remote area. There's no convenient monks nearby for you to make confession to. When I was living in America, like when I was living in Bellingham, Bellingham, Washington, and I was the only monk in town, that I would make confession over the phone. Although if you're living in a remote area, out in a forest somewhere, you're probably not going to have cell phone reception or anything like that. So, yeah, that is like a valid excuse not to make confession if you're living in a remote area by yourself. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Chicory Dick. And unless Chicory Dick has changed his name to Chicory Dick from some other name that I am familiar with, this is the first time Chicory Dick has asked questions. And Chicory Dick says, do you still love Moby Dick? And I've mentioned elsewhere that Moby Dick is one of my favorite novels. It has more profundity to it than a great many scriptures, including the Old Testament. When I was taking English classes in college, I had an instructor inform me that Moby Dick and Huckleberry Finn are the two greatest American novels ever written. Although, who knows, maybe another one has been written since then, and I don't know which one it is. So do I still love Moby Dick? It's still one of my favorite novels. It is a profound novel. So, yeah, I suppose I still love Moby Dick. I mean, if he's just referring to the whale and not the novel, then yeah, I still have a lot of respect for Moby Dick, who, as I put forward in an essay long ago, really does symbolically represent the left fist of God, or just God in general. That Moby Dick is a manifestation of God. And Melville in the novel does point out that one of the first avatars of Vishnu, who is considered the supreme god by Vaishnavite Hindus, was a giant fish. And I mean, there's all these reasons. I mean, I don't know if my essay is still, I think my essay still is, it's on my new blog. I reprinted it from my old blog onto my new blog. So it is there. And I do consider it to be one of the best things I've written. It'd probably be in my top 10 of favorite essays that I've written. That, I mean, it's got some Dhamma in it, but it's not specifically Theravada Buddhist. But I mean, it talks about how Moby Dick had a reputation for being immortal, that he had a reputation for being in various places at the same time. There's an emphasis on he has no face, that if you see him underwater, he has no, you can't get close enough to see him without dying. But if you pull him out of the water, you pull a whale out of the water, they lose their shape. So they're essentially formless. Because Moby Dick was white, he was essentially colorless. And also, he spent most of his time on the equator, in like the center of the Pacific Ocean, which is like the middle of everything. So you have this faceless, colorless, formless, immortal, omnipresent being that lives in the center of the world, the center of all things. I mean, pretty obviously to me, even though a lot of people don't get it, that's God. Especially to like a transcendentalist, an American transcendentalist who lived like in the mid to late 1800s, when that was really a big thing going on. So, yeah, I still love Moby Dick. So I'll just move on to Chicory Dick's second question, which is, what are your top 5 desert island books? No scripture, sutta, self-help textbooks, etc. So I assume getting a book on how to survive on desert islands would not be allowed. And no scripture either. So this is kind of limiting, isn't it? Maybe Moby Dick would be on my list of 5 desert island books. Gene Wolfe's The Book of the New Sun. I mean, that's like 5 books all right there. But if that counted as one book, The Book of the New Sun, I mean, that's what it's called, right? Even though it's like 5 volumes, then yeah, I might just go with Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun as one of them. I mean, seriously, I might even consider taking all 5 volumes and just have that be my 5 books. But if who's ever like banishing me to that island and is in charge of the books and all that, he's in a good mood that day. He's in magnanimous. He lets the Book of the New Sun count as one book. So I'd have Moby Dick, Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun. Gosh. Maybe a short story collection by Brian Aldiss called Moment of Eclipse. I think that's the one that contains the short story called Equanimity, which is really an excellent short story. It's about these 3 cloned brothers called Erlowry. You know, they're just clones of each other, identical triplets. And this is like in the far distant future. And this breed of human is cloned specifically for one purpose, and that is missionaries. So these 3 Erlowry brothers are sent to this frontier planet to set up a shrine to the omniscient God, which is an omniscient computer. So they have to build this shrine and like set up the computer and turn it on and everything, and then their job is done. And part of their philosophy is indifference. I guess the name of the story is Indifference and not Equanimity. I think I might have said Equanimity at first. But I mean, it's really a nice story. The very ending of it is very sweet too. But getting back to desert island books, maybe Dostoevsky's The Idiot. The Idiot or Crime and Punishment. I'd have to have one by Dostoevsky. Because I mean, like, books on how to survive on desert islands aren't allowed. Scriptures aren't allowed. So, gosh. I mean, there could be some way of getting around that. You could get just some kind of like mechanical encyclopedia or something that might let you, even though technically it's not a textbook, or self-help, it might help you to figure out, how to build things that you need on desert islands. Let's see. Gosh. I mean, another way of cheating would be to get a novel about some survivalist and just like, take down notes on what he's doing to stay alive. So anyways, let's see. I had Moby Dick, Book of the New Sun, Moment of Eclipse, Dostoevsky's The Idiot, and what would be number 5? Gosh. This is tough because I really never made up a list or anything. As you can tell, I mean, sometimes I might think about how I would answer a question, but this is not one of them. Maybe Ridley Walker by Russell Hoban. It's always been one of my favorite stories. Ridley Walker, and that's also, it's like a post-apocalyptic story about like 2,000 years in the future when it's also like 2,000 years after a thermonuclear World War III civilization is just building itself back up to the level of agriculture from hunter-gatherer societies. Ridley Walker, he's a member of one of the few remaining hunter-gatherer tribes in southeastern England at this point. And the entire book is written in a kind of pidgin English that takes some getting used to. Some people just can't get past the weird spelling and grammar of Ridley Walker. Like the word once is just a numeral 1 with CE after it. So, okay, I think I answered that one. So I'm moving on to Chicory Dick's third question, which is, do you think it's possible to write a book like Moby Dick today? It's possible to write it, but I don't think Moby Dick, if Moby Dick hadn't been written by Herman Melville in the 1800s and was written now by somebody else, it wouldn't get famous. He might find difficulty finding anyone willing to publish it. He might self-publish on Amazon. Nobody would buy it. A few people would buy it. They think this is a masterpiece. It doesn't matter because, first of all, Moby Dick is about whaling, which is politically incorrect. Not nearly as politically incorrect as it was like back in the 1980s. But, it's just not really an issue anymore. We've moved on to other issues that we're supposed to consider to be important. So, anti-whaling propaganda, you don't see much anymore. I don't know if the Japanese or Norwegians or whoever are still hunting whales in limited quantities, but it's just not really an issue anymore. But Moby Dick, it would just be bashed for racism, even though at the time it was bashed for not being racist enough because Moby Dick, Herman Melville, he's trying to portray certain non-white ethnicities as equal to or even superior to white people in certain ways. So, he's got Queequeg, who's he's like a South Sea Island cannibal with sharpened teeth, who is portrayed as more noble than most white people. But at the same time, Herman Melville is realistic in his portrayal of these people. And, he freely admits Queequeg was a headhunter and a cannibal. And also the way he portrays black people, it's realistic, but realism doesn't go anymore. When you portray black people, you have to either glorify them or portray them in a way that very few black people actually exist. Like commercials. There's so many commercials on TV with black families, and it's like the husband, that for starters, he's wearing like a cardigan. They're living in this McMansion, this really nice place, and it does not represent the way most black people are. And if you did have a commercial that represented black people as, the average, black person, statistically speaking, it would just get bashed for being racist because reality is racist now. So also, I guess, transcendentalist spiritualism, which is what Moby Dick is largely about. That and whaling. That also, I mean, it's just not in vogue anymore. So, yeah, it is possible to write a book like Moby Dick, but with regard to getting it to sell, having it declared one of the greatest American novels, and that's an entirely different ball of fish, or kettle of wax, I should say. So, I mean, with regard to just the profundity of it and like the spiritual undertones and overtones and all that, Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun is comparable in profundity to Moby Dick. So, I mean, that kind of book like Moby Dick could still be written and can still be very popular. Although it may be that most people have never heard of Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, but it is a masterpiece. I would consider that to be one of the greatest American books ever written. So, I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says he asked this question like two Q&As ago, but it was like after the deadline. I didn't see it. So maybe this question should be the very first question. Anyways, Rui says, how unusual is it to become a wandering mendicant a year or two after entering the robes? Well, I assume it's relatively unusual. I mean, first of all, a new monk, a Navaka monk, a newcomer, he has to live in dependence on his preceptor or on what's the word? Signified? No, it's not it. Just like an official teacher, an acharya. He has to live in dependence on one of those for at least 5 years. So he couldn't just take off wandering legally. I mean, he'd probably be breaking a rule of monastic discipline. There are some loopholes, like at the very least, I mean, he can stay away from his preceptor and teacher with their like consent if he is like enjoying solitude in a forest area. But that doesn't apply to the rains retreat, or at least my teacher of monastic discipline told me that during the rains retreat, the 3 months of the rains retreat, still he's got to go back and stay with his preceptor or his acharya, his teacher, his designated teacher is the word I was trying to come up with, during the rains retreat. So, I mean, it is allowable to some degree that within a year or two of being ordained, you can take off wandering, but you have to take off wandering with your preceptor or teacher, or at the very least, you can wander a bit in remote forest areas and then come back and stay with your preceptor or teacher during the rains retreat. But some monks famously, especially Ajahn Chah, he didn't become like a wandering mendicant until a number of years after he ordained. He was already, free of his nisya, his dependence on a preceptor or teacher, but he was like a teacher himself, like at some monastic school. And finally, I mean, he's reading these texts, and it just kind of dawned on him, or just sort of gradually just overpowered his attitude of, why am I in a school monastery teaching when I should be following what these texts say I should do? So that's when he left the school monastery and really became like a meditating yogi. So it does happen. It can happen to a monk at, any stage where they just realize, they keep reading these texts saying that a monk should be wandering in the forest or just wandering alone. And, they're staying at some cushy monastery. And a lot of monks, some monks, like a lot of dogmatic kind of monks, they'll just kind of read the text saying how a monk should live. And it just, they're just like referencing it in their mind as just like abstract information that does not apply to them. That was for ancient times or something. A lot of Christians read the Bible the same way. Their eyes just kind of gloss over when it gets to something they don't want to follow. Like, gather not up your treasures upon the earth, for example. So, it can happen at any time. But if it happens during the first 5 years, there are certain limitations to what is allowable. So, I'm not sure how unusual it is for monks to become a wandering mendicant, just, at least a year after they've been ordained. It does happen though, but generally they would have to wait for 5 years before they're like a free agent and can just go off on their own without having to be independent on somebody else. So I'm going to move on to Rui's next question, which is kind of an interesting one. Did you ever have fever hallucinations? And then he continues here. I experienced some last night. There was nothing nasty about the images, which were actually quite pedestrian, but the loop repetition was quite disturbing. I suppose we can handle, or at least get used to, the horrors of samsara, but its structure is more inaccessible. Well, yes, I have had fever hallucinations that I can remember once. I was about 19 years old, and I came down with pneumonia. And I was lying on my back in bed, coughing and coughing and coughing. This is before I went to the hospital. I think I went to the hospital later on that same day. And as I'm lying on my back coughing, I start hallucinating. It looks like oil derricks, sort of like the oil derricks, like on the Houston Oilers football helmet. I don't know if they still have that on the football helmet. I don't watch pro football anymore. Or there was also like an old arcade video game based on Star Wars. It had like these oil derrick things sprouting up out of, I think it was the Death Star, and you had to like avoid them, or they're like shooting at you or something. And I mean, it was like that. They were sprouting out of my chest, and when it reached full size, it would just burst out of the top, like a gusher, and then I would cough. I would cough simultaneously with the top of the oil derrick bursting, and then it would just fade out. But there would always be like 2 or 3 more at different stages of growth on my chest and upper abdomen at the time. And that's the only fever hallucination I can remember having. So I guess I answered the question. So I'm going to move on to Rui's third question, which is, do you think the hallucinatory experience, provided one survives it, can shed light on the repetitional structure of samsara? So I'm not exactly sure how hallucinations would specifically shed light on the repetitional structure of samsara. Maybe, it's sort of like you're hallucinating something that you've seen before, or at least a variation on something that you've seen before, so that is recurring, so it's like a repetition. But I assume for some people, yeah, you can get insights from just about anything. You can get insights from seeing a dog licking his balls. But then other people, they can be exposed to just really obvious like symbols that represent something profound. They can, or like the monks that I was referring to just minutes ago, how they can read profound texts, and it doesn't occur to them that it should apply to them personally. It's just information. And, they don't even try to like contemplate it, understand it. They'll just read the commentary and see what the commentary says. And they'll just say, well, that's what it means. So, yeah, I think for some people, but definitely not for everybody. Let's see. And with regard to shedding light on the repetitional structure of samsara, I assume so. But I don't have any personal experience with regard to hallucinations shedding light on repetitional structure of samsara, at least fever hallucinations that really didn't ask about other kinds of hallucinations. But with regard to any hallucinations I've ever had, it didn't really cause any insights with regard to the repetitional structure of samsara. But I assume that there's all kinds of people out there. Some people are more sensitive to certain kinds of insights than others. I wouldn't at all be surprised. So let's say yes, it can shed light on the repetitional structure of samsara. And so I'm going to move on to the next question, which is from Siovaksha and Sipad Zirna. And Siovaksha and Sipad Zirna says, any practical advice on stopping comparing myself to others? And then he gives the example of seeing whether someone is mogging me or not subconsciously. I'm getting paranoid of being mogged in public, and I'm starting to avoid going outside to avoid it. So, Siovach and Sipad Zidna is possibly the only person I know who has the word mog in his working vocabulary. Up until this morning, I was not fully aware of what mog even means. It means something kind of negative, of somebody kind of giving you a hard time. But I wanted to find out what mogging literally meant before answering this question. So I looked it up, and there's one website that says the following, and I quote, "The word mogging is derived from the acronym AMOG, which stands for Alpha Male of the Group. To mog someone is to assert one's dominance over them with the hopes of impressing women. The word comes from pickup artist communities that are preoccupied with the urge to attract women, despite having some pretty misogynistic conceptions of them." And yeah, I've noticed that too. A lot of pickup artists will have sort of misogynistic conceptions about women, or just, certain biases against women, that sort of thing. So anyways, getting back to the question here though, any practical advice on stopping comparing myself to others, especially he's paranoid about being mogged in public. And that's just kind of strange to me that he wouldn't want to just go out in public because he thinks somebody is going to assert dominance over him. And it may be that Siovach and Sipad Zidna does not include the part about in order to impress women who might happen to be watching. Like he's at the beach and some big muscle guy kicks sand in his face, that kind of thing. For starters, he did get some really good advice from my woman on the Discord server. He asked this on the Discord server, and she pointed out that, most people walking down the street, the overwhelming majority, are not thinking about him at all. They might glance at him as just kind of an obstacle to navigate around on the sidewalk. But, they're not thinking any negative thoughts about him. He's just not, he's just an extra in the background of their own personal movie. Most people just are not thinking about him. And, why would anybody mog him anyway? It's just kind of strange. In a previous question, he was asking about, he was mentioning that he's self-conscious about his height, that because people mog him about how short he is, but he's well over 6 feet tall. Because I guess it's just in his family, most of his male relatives are taller than he is. And that's kind of the case in my family too. Most of my male relatives, especially on my father's side of the family, were taller than me. My father was taller than me. He was 6'6" in his prime, although we got pretty close to the same height by the time he was in his 80s. So yeah, the first thing is just, face the extreme likelihood that this is largely an irrational fear, that most people are not gonna be thinking about you positively or negatively. But also, just general mindfulness. And when you see this arise, you see it as an arising mental state. And then if it's some sort of irrational worry or fear or whatever, then you can just note it as that, irrational fear arising, just irrational thought arising. And you make a habit of that. And whenever something arises and you observe it, mindfully, it's not you anymore. So if you're unmindful and let's say worry arises in your mind, it's I'm worried. But if you're being mindful and worry arises in your mind, it's worry is arising. So that you've already created a kind of philosophical detachment from it. So talk some sense to yourself along the lines of what my lovely mate was saying. And also just exercise mindfulness of mental states like this that arise in your mind. And that's about the best you can do, I think. If anyone else has any suggestions, feel free to add them in the comments. And I'm going to move on to Siovach and Sipad Zidna's next question, which is, when is the next sutta discussion? And yeah, it's long overdue. In fact, somebody specifically requested that I do a sutta discussion of the Kalaha Viwada Sutta, which is one of the suttas, the Atthaka Vagga. I don't recall having done a video about that one. I might have to go back and look at my short playlist, Studies in Archaic Buddhism, to see if I've already done a sutta on the Kalahawiwada Sutta. But if I haven't, that would probably be the next one. It's not one of my favorites, but it does have certain very significant parts to it. I mean, the end, towards the end, is very profound. There's like this koan-like statement, like 2/3 of the way through. And also, it is an example of proto-paccekabuddhas. I mean, it's fairly obviously one of the early prototypes of the 12 Nidana theory of paccekabuddhas. If you don't know what that means, just wait till I get to the video and do it, and then you can watch that and I'll explain it better. So let's shoot for within the next few weeks. And I may be doing an aquarium video soon, maybe tomorrow. But it's not ironclad yet. Let's see here. So I'll just move on to Siovakshan Sipat Zirna's next question, which is tips on being disciplined in life. And that's a difficult one. Because seriously, I mean, I referred to Schopenhauer's first philosophical essay over and over again. It's the fourfold root of sufficient reason. It's like the 4 different kinds of reasons for something happening. Not just like excuses, but the actual causes or reasons for something to happen or to exist. And one of them is psychological. And he says that a person with a certain personality is going to react in the same way to the same stimuli. You know, the same thing keeps happening. You're going to keep reacting in the same way until your personality changes. Your attitude changes. Your perceptions are going to have to change in order to act differently. So I think sooner or later, if you're just undisciplined, you can't bring yourself to like exercise regularly, for example, or meditate regularly, then eventually, I mean, it's going to cause problems for you. And those problems, if they build up sufficiently, it could cause some kind of crisis that's going to require you to reassess your attitude. So, like, for example, I'll give the example before about how my father tried to quit smoking several times. You know, he'd stop. He would smoke 2 packs a day, then he'd stop. And then, well, he's going to like chew a little tobacco every now and then, or like smoke a pipe every now and then. And within a few more weeks, he's right back to 2 packs a day again. And then his legs started to turn black. And he had a log roll over that leg and crush it. There was capillary damage in that leg. It was pretty much healed up, but still there were damaged capillaries. And the tar from the cigarettes were clogging up the capillaries in his leg, and his leg was turning black. And the doctor told him, you've got a choice. You stop smoking or we amputate your leg. And then when it came to that, I mean, that was a radical enough shift in his attitude, in his perception of the situation, that all of a sudden to stop smoking stopped being this struggle. And really, I mean, to discipline yourself, to have a struggle, I mean, that's like a red flag. That's like an early warning sign. Like if you're trying to exercise and you're struggling to do it, or you're trying to find the time to meditate every day, you're struggling to do it, then, I mean, the soonest convenient excuse to skip a day, you'll take it. So it's like, if you want to discipline yourself, one thing you got to do is just make it not a big deal. You know, it's just something I'm going to do. That's it. You know, you have to have a tanha, you have to have determination to stick with something instead of falling off the wagon after a few weeks, just at the nearest convenient excuse or opportunity. And the more you meditate, the more insight and wisdom you acquire. Generally, the easier discipline is self-discipline. It may be, I'm not exactly sure what else. I mean, if you had some sort of cruel taskmaster watching over you who would punish you if you didn't do well, you know, like in some old-fashioned Zen monasteries, you got the guy with the stick something like that. The Roshi with a stick. But if you're on your own, then you have to rely on yourself and really, you have to just have firm adhitthana, firm determination that you are going to do this. And I tend to be pretty well disciplined when I want to be, but it's something that you got to be careful about, because if you're just kind of half-hearted or half-assed about something, you're better off not like committing yourself to doing that. You're better off just, if you're honest with yourself, it's like, well, I'm not so sure I really want to do that. So, if there's something you really, really want to accomplish, then first of all, you decide, yes, I really, really want to accomplish this. And then you figure out what you need to do in order to accomplish that. And then you do it with determination, and you don't give up, and you don't start fudging and just taking days off, which get longer and longer. It's like first you take off a day or two, you go on vacation or something, it's not convenient. And then it's like it starts happening more and more. It's like, for me, like reciting the Patimokkha. It was something I could do as a monk. I would recite the Bhikkhu Patimokkha. It was my duty at some monasteries to do the Patimokkha recitation. And then it's just kind of boring to like keep reciting it over and over again when you're alone. Because, I'm not Asian. Some Asian monks, they can just recite the same thing for 2 hours straight every night. They don't get tired of it. It doesn't bore them. But just doing the same thing over and over again, it just is kind of boring to me. And so I started living alone in a forest where the Bhikkhu Patimokkha did not need to be recited. When I was staying in a monastery where it was my duty, I'd have to recite it over and over so as not to forget it, in between Uposatha days. But when I'm living alone, there's no Bhikkhu Patimokkha recitation, then I just sort of do it less and less often until finally I was forgetting it. So you got to have good reasons and good determination in order to be disciplined with regard to this or that. And I'm moving on to the next question now. This is from Austin. And Austin, I think it was the previous Q&A, asked if there's some way of differentiating genuine knowledge from delusion when you're meditating. And I said no. Anything that arises is going to be delusional to some degree. And you can't be aware of your own delusion, because then it's not really delusion anymore. So anyways, this is kind of like a follow-up question. Austin says, if there is no fundamental means to distinguish between truth and delusion in our meditative experiences, how can Buddhism justify its claims, given that its foundational claims rest on the Buddha's own meditative experiences and enlightenment? And then there's a little bit of additional information that he added later, which is, how do I know what I observe is true? Because, as was answered in the previous Q&A, there's not a method to adequately determine what is true and what is delusional in meditation. I'm asking a deeper question on what justifies our experiences in meditation as being a true belief or an axiom to start at. Even to claim that empiricism is true as a justified belief is itself not an empirically justified claim. Well, with regard to something that arises, there's always going to be a certain amount of delusion involved. However, you can get farther and farther away from delusion. For example, just going with Abhidhamma philosophy, that, like, for example, if you're meditating on the breath, if you're breathing, if you're noting breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. Well, breathing in and breathing out are not ultimately real. They're not ultimate realities, even according to Abhidhamma. But if you're just observing the sensation of breathing, like the sensation of touch at the nostrils as the air is going in and out, Vedana, or feeling, according to Abhidhamma, that is an ultimate reality. And even according to me, it's a much more subtle form of delusion, because there's going to be a certain amount of perception involved, and the perception is delusion, or at least illusion. So, you can attenuate the delusion. You can make the delusion less. The less you think. If you get to something like what St. John of the Cross calls dark faith, or fourth jhana, you get into a deep jhanic state where thinking stops, then delusion, like the main kind of delusion, has stopped. So it's not like you have to differentiate or distinguish between, this idea is a true idea, this idea is a delusional idea. It's just that you get away from the ideas, and then there's this reality underlying them. And you get closer and closer to this silent reality. But it may be, based on what Austin is saying here, that he just wants to know the difference between like conventional right view and conventional wrong view, even though conventional right view is conventional truth, which is not ultimately true. It's skillful means, going with Mahayana terminology. So if you want to distinguish between what is useful, even though it's not ultimate truth, and what is not useful, or worse than useful, or worse than just not useful, just going within the realm of conventional truth, symbolic truth, then you'd have to just rely on just empirical self-observation. If you follow this, does it help? That's like pragmatism. You have to use like pragmatism, I guess, or you could compare your experiences with what the texts say. If you trust that particular text, you can go to a wise teacher who you consider to be wiser than you and have him, judge your experience, or just observe it, hear about it, tell you his impression on whether that's likely to be useful to you or beneficial to you or not. So I think it was a certain school of Majjhimaka, some Mahayana schools anyway, who divided up into essentially three truths. In Theravada Buddhism, Orthodox Theravada, or just traditional Theravada, you've got ultimate truth and conventional truth. Conventional truth is the level that almost everybody is stuck at. Conventional truth is like the Kantian thing in itself. Most people can't touch it, even though they're exposed to it all the time. They just can't deal with it because they're stuck in like perceptual mode. So anyway, some Mahayana schools divided up this conventional truth, which isn't ultimately true, into two kinds of conventional truth. There's just like useful, wise conventional truth that helps you to eventually transcend conventional truth. And that would be like Dhamma. And then there's just unwise, delusional, conventional truth that doesn't help you at all. It just makes things worse. And that would be sort of like the philosophy of Kant again, where, the thing in itself you can't touch, but then he's like analyzing the structure of delusion and like trying to understand that, which, it's still not the thing in itself. It's still not ultimately true, but at least it's helpful in helping you to transcend this being stuck in perception. So in your meditation, if you're perceiving less without just going into an unconscious stupor, where if you're wide awake still and your thoughts become fewer, your perceptions become fewer, then the veil gets thinner and there's less in between your level of understanding and ultimate reality. So, let's see. But how do you know what you observe is true? If you don't interpret it, if you just abolish interpretation, then you're much closer to the actual truth or reality than if you start thinking about it and interpreting it and symbolizing it. So I hope I answered that question, because I'm moving on to the next one. This is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam. And he says, in regard to this sutta, and then the remaining is a quote here, or what's coming next is a quote. Quote, with regard to external factors, I don't envision any other single factor like friendship with admirable people as doing so much for a monk in training who has not attained the heart's goal but remains intent on the unsurpassed safety from bondage. A monk who is a friend with admirable people abandons what is unskillful and develops what is skillful. And that's from the Iti Wudaka number 17. And then Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, says, could right view be an attainment facilitated by something like group spirit? Well, I mean, with regard to this sutta, he's talking about the Kalyanamita, I assume. It doesn't, I mean, it's probably the word Kalyanamita is in there somewhere, like the good friend. This isn't the only sutta. There's one sutta in the Nikayas where the Buddha is saying that having a good friend or a Kalyanamita is the whole of the holy life. And I mean, it's kind of a weird statement to make, considering that, you know, there are other things that are probably more important than having a good and wise friend. But having a good and wise friend who can guide you, who's wiser than you are, yeah, that is very valuable. So then he's saying, could right view be an attainment facilitated by something like group spirit? Well, it can be facilitated by something like group spirit because, as I've said before, mental states are contagious. That if you associate with wise people, you cultivate the company of wise people, they're going to uplift you. And if you associate with fools, you cultivate the company of foolish people, they're going to drag you down. Because mental states are contagious. They're going to affect your mind. So, right view, whatever that is to you, then certainly it could be helped by just hanging out with wise Dhamma-oriented people and not hanging out so much with foolish people or just indoctrinated worldly normies. So I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, previously known as Liberlam, or formerly known as Liberlam's next question, which is, do you consider it fitting to talk about the tetralemma of the enlightened being after death in terms of a fruitive spirit, or is spirit necessarily a form of existence? And I'm not exactly sure what he means by fruitive, that it's not in my dictionary. The word fruitive does not exist in my dictionary. On the computer, I typed in fruitive and it tried to correct it to furtive. And furtive is something where you don't want to say the whole truth because the whole truth might be ugly, so you're careful about not saying the whole truth, kind of a thing. But I'm not sure that Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Liberlam, really does mean that. I think fruitive spirit, I think he might mean that it's just like a sankhara. It's like this conditioned, impermanent entity or quasi-entity, because he compares that to spirit necessarily being a form of existence, which might mean that it's not impermanent and not a sankhara, or not conditioned. But he who was formerly known as Liberlam does ask these really cerebral kind of questions that are hard to decipher sometimes. So, do I consider it fitting to talk about the tetralemma of the enlightened being after death? And the tetralemma of the enlightened being after death is the enlightened being does exist after death, the enlightened being doesn't exist after death, the enlightened being does and doesn't exist after death, and the enlightened being neither does nor does not exist after death. Those are like the four options in classical Buddhist logic. And do I consider that to be fitting in terms of a fruitive spirit? So what is the spirit that he who was formerly known as Liberlam is referring to? That's like my first question is what is this spirit he's referring to? I think he's referring to like the spirit does exist after death. The spirit of an enlightened being does or doesn't, or does and doesn't, or neither does nor doesn't exist after death. And none of those is valid. All four options are invalid with regard to an enlightened being. And part of it is that you just can't nail down an enlightened being. That, I mean, they're off the scale. And their spirit, so-called, is just off the scale. I mean, it's neither is or nor isn't, nor is and isn't, nor neither is nor isn't. It's just, so, I mean, the spirit itself would, I mean, the same tetralemma, I assume, would apply to the spirit. So, is it necessarily a form of existence? Well, is it not necessarily a form of existence? Is it and is not a necessary form of existence? Or is it neither or not a necessary form of existence? I mean, that's generally what it gets down to. So the whole question would be invalid in that sense. Let's see, do I consider it fitting? I mean, that's like the key of the question here. Do I consider it fitting to talk about the tetralemma of the enlightened being after death in terms of a fruitive spirit, which I still don't fully understand, or is spirit necessarily a form of existence? So we can logically deduce that a fruitive spirit is not necessarily a form of existence. Which I guess, I mean, from the Buddhist point of view, a spirit would not necessarily be is not a form of existence. Gosh. He who was formerly known as Lieberlam asks these really just like abstruse kind of questions that are difficult to decipher. So, yeah, let's just say it's not fitting. And move on to the next question here. And if he wants to clarify, like in plain English with not lots of syllables, what he was asking, I can give it another shot. So this next question is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, can you explain the difference between tanha and chanda? And both of them are often translated as desire. Tanha is usually translated as craving. Literally, it means thirst. Whereas chanda, I usually translate it as preference. So there's a lot of overlap between just craving and preference. You know, chanda would be like a strong preference. But they're not necessarily exactly the same because, for example, chanda also is a technical term in monastic discipline where there's a monk who is too sick even to be carried on a stretcher to a formal act of the Sangha. He's too sick even to do that, or for whatever reason, he cannot attend a formal act of the Sangha. So he sends his chanda. Sometimes it's translated as consent, but I would translate it as his preference. You know, he's got to participate in a vote. And so he's going to send his chanda as his vote of approval or disapproval to some formal act of the Sangha. So that's one reason why I generally translate chanda as preference or strong preference, because of that aspect of it. But chanda might be more of a neutral sort of desire, whereas tanha is more of a thirsty, craving kind of desire. But there is a lot of overlap between the two. And maybe I should look it up in the dictionary, but I don't think I'm going to this time. So, because I have to look up two different words, and that would take twice as long probably. So let's see here. Yeah, there is overlap between tanha and chanda, but I think chanda is more ethically neutral and can just mean preference. So, Xenothoid's second question is, do Buddhas still experience chanda? Well, you're getting into, I'm flirting with unorthodoxy here, flirting with heresy, because I think it's possible that a Buddha could still experience tanha at like a superficial level, like it arises in the mind just through the force of past karma. But an enlightened being does not, just observes it mindfully, does not identify with it, doesn't get carried away with it. You know, it can still arise. I think that enlightened beings still show, at least outwardly, that they have preferences. Neem Karoli Baba had certain foods that he liked better than other kinds of food, for example. The Buddha himself apparently preferred silence to noise. He'd get on the case of monks that were being too noisy, that sort of thing. So I would say that they experience it at a superficial level, just because they are human. They've got this past karma that's still causing this stuff to arise. It's just that they are not lost in it anymore. You know, they can just observe it arise and pass away and not get lost in it. So I hope I answered that one, because I'm moving on to the next question from Xenothoid, which is the thing that separates Buddhas from paccekabuddhas their amount of chanda? If not, then what does? Yeah, I don't think that their chanda would differentiate a Buddha from a paccekabuddha. A paccekabuddha, for those of you who are like unfamiliar with obscure terms like paccekabuddha, is a fully enlightened Buddha who nevertheless doesn't start Buddhism. He does not start the wheel of Dhamma rolling because he remains a hermit. He's this fully enlightened, omniscient, more or less, being who arises between dispensations of fully enlightened Buddhas, of Sambuddhas. So paccekabuddhas, according to Theravada, only exist at times when there is no Buddhism in the world. And for their own reasons, they do not start Buddhism again. They do not start the wheel of Dhamma rolling. They remain hermits. And the official reason for that is that, they're pretty much the same as a Sambuddha, except that for whatever reason, they won't or just can't explain Dhamma. And it may be that they just won't. Like, according to the legend, our Buddha, Gautama Buddha, almost became a paccekabuddha because he figured nobody was going to understand paticca samuppada, or dependent co-arising. So then Mahabrahma had to come down from heaven and beg him to teach Buddhism, because there's going to be at least a few people who have little dust in their eyes. And then the Buddha kind of used his clairvoyance and saw, all right, yeah, there's some people that'll understand it. And so then he went ahead and didn't become a paccekabuddha. He became a Sambuddha. So it could be there are some who they're so much into ultimate truth or ultimate reality that they don't even want to deal with this manifestations of like conventional truth, this delusional samsara. They're just focused on the goal which they have attained. They're just like dwelling in this state of the absolute, and they don't want to be wallowing in the muck of symbolic perception and like normal worldliness anymore. So that could be part of it. Or, the implication in some of the texts is that for some reason they can't explain Dhamma. It's like they've just transcended samsara to such a degree that they can't come back down into it and like use the language of samsara to try and help other beings. But at any rate, it's not the amount of chanda that differentiates a Buddha from a paccekabuddha. It's their capability and or willingness to explain Dhamma to other people that differentiates them. And so I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Maitreya Buddha. And this might be the last question we ever get from Maitreya Buddha, because he has informed me that he has unsubscribed because somebody was censoring his comments, which is probably not me, but the people who run this platform, or the computers who run this platform. I'm referring to YouTube, by the way. So anyways, Maitreya Buddha says, why do you believe in the staged fake shooting of Donald Trump? It took place during his presidential campaign, meaning that it was a staged event for a publicity stunt. His ear looks completely unscathed now, as if it never happened. Well, this is kind of a strange reasoning here to say that it took place during his presidential campaign, meaning that it was a staged event for a publicity stunt. Does that mean that nobody can really try to shoot somebody if they're running for office? That it's just somehow impossible? That there's some wacko who just does not want this person to win the election, so they try to shoot him to make sure he doesn't win the election? That is somehow impossible? I don't think so. In fact, it makes perfect sense. Why shoot him if he's not running for office? There's no need to shoot him then if you don't want him to be president. But if you don't want him to be president, and neither of these two people, Crooks and what the other guy's name is, they just did not want him to win the election. So they took matters into their own hands, and of course, fortunately, they fucked up. So, if this is a staged fake shooting, just setting that aside, a staged fake shooting, somebody really did get shot. In fact, a few people really did get shot. 2 people were shot dead. So is Trump so evil that he's willing to have people killed just for a publicity stunt? I don't think so. Just consider Occam's razor. It is more likely that somebody really did shoot at him, grazed his ear with a bullet right as he turned his head. I mean, he clearly wasn't expecting it. I mean, he's not that good of an actor. And also the entire Secret Service who are in the tank with the Biden administration. I mean, they're like Biden Secret Service, plus a bunch of just Homeland Security people that took a webinar for a few hours to qualify them to be his bodyguards. I mean, they'd all have to be in on it. I mean, why is that? So, with regard to his ear not showing signs of being wounded, I mean, if he wears a bandage, people make fun of that. Oh, look how this big bandage he's got on show. And then if he doesn't wear a bandage, and is presumably, I mean, they've got like makeup and stuff, they can cover up the scab, that kind of thing. Why not? Because if he doesn't, he's going to catch hell from that too. Oh, he's just putting it on display for everyone to see. Another publicity stunt. So, first of all, I mean, the fact that this attempted assassination occurred during his presidential campaign does not mean necessarily that it was a staged event for a publicity stunt. And the fact that his ear looks completely unscathed now means that he's rich. He's got people that can fix up his ear so it doesn't have this big ugly scab on it. So why do I believe in the staged fake shooting of Donald Trump? Well, because it's pretty obvious to me that it was very likely to be real, and that 2 people actually did die, and a few other people were seriously wounded by gunshots. Man. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from White Ash Piper. And White Ash Piper says, I get the point on the snake and frog story. My take is that I don't know the snake story, and the way I see it is this could have been the one frog that saved his life. What right do I have to steal a meal? So this is getting back to the story of the frog and the snake that I've told several times at this point. It's like my favorite example, my go-to example of 2 people performing outwardly the exact same action. One of them's getting good karma for it. The other person's getting bad karma for it. And it's like a snake trying to swallow a frog, and you chase the snake away. You save the frog, you chase the snake away. And if you do it out of compassion, you've done something good. If you do it out of compassion for the frog, you've done something good. If you do it out of compassion or hatred for the snake, you've done something bad. So it's the motivation. If you're motivated by compassion, you've done something good. If you're motivated by hatred, you've done something bad, even though the outward action is exactly the same. So the question here is, what right do I have to steal a meal? And this reminds me of when I was talking about this or a similar topic in the previous Q&A. I had this other example that eluded me, and now I remember it again. It's with regard to monks and stealing. That for a monk to steal something of a certain value, which is a coin, the value of an ancient coin called a pada, if he steals something as worth that much or more, he's excommunicated for life. He is kicked out of the Sangha. So the text, because this rule is so important, it's like you have to know exactly for sure whether a monk is or is not excommunicated. That's an important thing to know. So they got all these sample cases like in legal books. And one case is you've got a monk in a forest who finds a trapped animal. There's a fox with this steel jaw clamped on its leg. So the monk lets the animal loose. So has he stolen from the trapper? And again, it depends on his motivation. If he does it out of compassion for the animal, he can do that. He can release an animal caught in some other person's trap. But if he does it out of resentment and vindictiveness against the trapper, it's like, this is what you're getting, you son of a bitch. I'm letting your animal go. So you're going to go hungry. Then he's guilty. He has actually stolen because his motivation was to deprive the trapper from what he had caught. Whereas in the previous example, he's motivated by compassion for the animal, and wanting to stick it to the trapper was just not part of his reason. So in that case, I mean, what right do you have to steal a meal? I mean, compassion is more important. You know, it's like, I mean, what right to steal a meal from a snake or a trapper? I mean, rights are themselves artificial, I think. I had one person actually leave the Discord server over this issue, that he was talking about rights, and one or two other people and me kind of were pointing out to him. I mean, we weren't like attacking him or anything, but just pointing out that, I mean, rights, I mean, what is a natural right? I mean, rights are just sort of like an abstract concept that we superimpose on society, but we don't really have rights that are just God-given. I mean, I'm not aware of them. They're like part of a social construct or something. So what right do I have to steal a meal? It's not really stealing if your motivation is not to steal. See, that's in Buddhist ethics, it's motivation. Like, for example, you don't have your glasses on or whatever, and you get on the wrong bicycle and ride it home. It's not until you get home that you realize that it's not your bike. It just looks like your bike. It was close to your bike on the rack. And so, you know, somebody could accuse you of stealing that, but you didn't steal it because you didn't have any intention of stealing. You have to have the intention to steal in order to steal something, just as you have to have the intention to lie in order to lie to somebody. There has to be the willful, deliberate intention to deceive somebody if you're going to lie. And then with regard to stealing, it's just the willful intention of taking for yourself or depriving somebody else of their property. So just turning an animal loose or saving a frog, that doesn't necessarily enter the picture. I mean, you may be incidentally depriving someone of a meal, but so long as that's not your intention, technically you haven't stolen. And who knows what the implication is going to be. That trapper, that was a good fox. He could have got some money, and he could have got medicine for his sick baby, for all you know. Not going to happen now, but I mean, you cannot take responsibility for all these unforeseeable ramifications of your actions. Or even if they're foreseeable, if that's not your purpose, like stepping on bugs on purpose, that's against the rules for a monk. That's against the rules for a Buddhist. You're not supposed to just be trampling on bugs. But there were times in Burma, like around the beginning of the rainy season, I mean, you go outside and the ground would be completely covered with little insects. And there's no way you could walk from point A to point B without stepping on some of them. And you knew you were going to step on them. You could see them there. There's just this mat of just clustered insects, some kind of little gnats or something. And so, I mean, so long as it's not your intention, you just want to get from point A to point B. You want to get to the outhouse or something. You just step on them. You just walk right across them and you kill lots and lots of them. But so long as you're not doing it like with the deliberate intention to kill them, then, I mean, that's really what makes it against the rules. Accidentally killing something, or just incidentally killing something, incidentally depriving someone of their meal. I mean, it still might be real in samsara somehow, but it's not on you ethically. It's like microaggressions. You know, microaggressions, it's just not really ethical. It's more political than ethical. Asking someone where they're from, telling some person from a foreign country that he speaks really good English, those are microaggressions. I even read back when microaggressions were a big deal, it's not so much anymore, that even for a man to stand up and let a woman take his seat on a crowded bus would be a microaggression. It was like, I don't know, benevolent patriarchy or something like that. So, I don't know if I've even answered this question though. What right do I have to steal a meal? I mean, you're not even really stealing, and rights are just sort of an artificial creation of the mind anyway, as far as I know. I mean, if someone can prove to me that rights really do exist out there in the ether, that's something else. I might take this back and possibly even eat a hat or something. So, Yeah, all right. I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Philalethes. Philalethes. I don't know how to pronounce some of these names. I'm winging it. I'm just doing the best I can. Philalethes says, I guess what unsettles me with all this, and I'm not exactly sure yet what all this is. I'll have to start over. I guess what unsettles me with all this is that if we're already enlightened, then samsaric things like love, hate, tragedy, comedy, beauty, ugliness, etc., don't seem to have any value at all. I'm guessing you're going to say that ultimately they do not, but within the bounds of this delusory world they do, in which case, wouldn't it drive you crazy to, on the other hand, embrace all of it as a delusion, and on the other, to partake in daily creating meaning and valuations, since as Nietzsche says, to live is to value. This is why I asked you about Nietzsche, since to me the cure or the core of his work is about this. Yeah, well, I don't really like Nietzsche that much. It's just revel in samsara, you know. So I mean, where's the main question here? Let's see. If we're already enlightened, then samsaric things like love, hate, tragedy, comedy, beauty, ugliness, etc., don't seem to have any value at all. I'm guessing you're going to say that ultimately they do not. Yeah, ultimately they don't. Like Eckhart Tolle says in his first famous book, I mean, the entire solar system or galaxy could explode. And in the grand scheme of things, like just from the point of view of ultimate being, it would be completely irrelevant, completely unimportant. So let's see. Where is the question? Where is the question mark? Okay. See, in which case, wouldn't it drive you crazy to, on the one hand, embrace all of it as delusion, and on the other, to partake in daily creating meaning and valuations, since, as Nietzsche says, to live is to value. You can still do it at, like, the surface level, that you're not identified with that anymore, but because you're a human, you have to act like a human. I think it's in the Zhuangzi where there's this little chapter talking about how, you know, the enlightened sage, he still behaves like a human being because he just happened to be born one. So, I mean, embracing all of it as delusion, I mean, that's going too far, I think. Embracing everything as delusion. I mean, it's just, you're just not attached to it anymore. That you're being mindful, and like an enlightened being, presumably, is mainly centered in ultimate truth. And then this like virtual truth, this conventional truth, is just like ripples at the surface. You know, he's down in the still water, but the ripples are still happening on top. And it's fine. It's nature taking its course. It's he's not going to be against it, because an enlightened being is neither for nor against. Those are like two extremes to be avoided. You take the middle path between for on one side and against on the other side. So, I mean, he might tell others that, you know, what they're wallowing in is delusion ultimately. But to him, I mean, he's fine. I mean, he's not denouncing anything really. You know, it's just nature taking its course. It's not ultimately real. You know, sort of like having a TV show on that, you know it's not real. It's not like you're against the TV show just because it's not real. So I think a lot of people have difficulty in like dealing with two levels of reality at the same time. You know, you've got the ultimate level and the conventional level, and they're just, I mean, it's not like you go from conventional to ultimate necessarily. It's both are always there. So it's just like the emphasis or the attention or the focus or where you are centered or whatever shifts, but it's still the same stuff going on. It's still the same. So it's not like, you know, you abolish the self in order to become enlightened, because there was no self to begin with. It was just that you believed that there was one, but the belief was in error. So, gosh, have I answered this question? I mean, it wouldn't drive, I mean, obviously it doesn't drive enlightened beings crazy, because on the one hand, I mean, they don't necessarily embrace all of it as delusion. I mean, they just see clearly what it is. See, that's the thing. It's not like they have this idea, this dogma that everything is delusion. They're just seeing clearly what it is. And it's just like ripples at the surface, nature taking its course. It's not them. It is not ultimately real, but they're not against it. So to partake in daily creating meaning and valuations, well, to the enlightened being, the meaning also is just sort of irrelevant. It's just, I mean, they know that meaning is delusion if you wallow in it. Because, I mean, that's what samsara is meaning. And it's symbols that are trying to represent something that they are not. And people can't tell the difference because they don't even have access to anything beyond the symbol in most cases. So, I mean, it wouldn't drive an enlightened being crazy. They're beyond that. It's the unenlightened person that is crazy. So I might have just made things worse by my answer, but I'm going to move on to Philalethi's second question here, which is, for most of my adult life, I've been drawn to the Buddhist view of Nibbana and infinite cosmology, but at the same time, I find it deeply depressing to reconcile with this view my love of certain things in this world. And when I stop loving anything, I become depressed, which, as we all know, is a form of attachment on its own. You yourself seem to have things you care about deeply, for example, your lady love. So I'm wondering how you reconcile that in the face of the ultimate delusion of I am. Well, you don't have to have an ego to love. In fact, there are some people, I think Eckhart Tolle is one of them, who say that when you become enlightened, you have perfected love. I mean, love is acceptance. Love, when you really love somebody or something, you've knocked down Pink Floyd's wall to some degree. There's like the barrier between self and other has broken down. And if you're enlightened, Pink Floyd's wall just doesn't exist anymore. And for those of you who are too young to know about Pink Floyd's wall, I'm sorry, I'm not going to explain it here. But it's like this wall you've got around your heart that most people put there to protect their heart, you know, for self-preservation or something. But I mean, they just wall themselves in. They can't really love anybody if they've got this wall completely in place. So when you're enlightened, you know, all barriers between self and other are down. And so that's just perfect love. I mean, it's all just us in a sense. So, I mean, your love increases the more enlightened you are. The wiser you are, the more capable you are of loving. Because love is like, I mean, love and ego are almost, I mean, they're almost incompatible. And love and Pink Floyd's wall are completely incompatible. So, let's see. The Buddhist view of Nibbana and cosmology. At the same time, I find it deeply depressing to reconcile with this view my love of certain things in this world. You yourself seem to have things you care about deeply, so I'm wondering how you reconcile that in the face of ultimate delusion of I am. The wiser you are, the more capable of love you are. For reasons that I've already tried to specify anyway. So, I mean, there's no problem there. I mean, you can love your enemies when you're wise. Fools can't love their enemies. You can love, in a way, you have to love evil even if you're enlightened. You're not endorsing it, you know, you're not suggesting it to anybody, but still, I mean, you forgive the bad people and you just accept the way things are. You have an open heart towards even evil people if you're fully enlightened. So, yeah, I really don't think that there is necessarily a problem there. It depends on what kind of love. If it's just some sort of like emotional attachment, then yeah, that can dissipate, but it's going to give way to something that's even deeper and better. So, I'm just going to move on to Philalethi's third question, which is, I suspect if I was a less nervous type of person, I would simply be able to adopt the view of Conan the Barbarian. I note which is as follows. It's not the destroyer, defeat the enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of the women. It's actually even wiser than that. Conan the Barbarian says, quote, I know this. If life is illusion, then I am no less an illusion. And being thus, the illusion is real to me. I live, I burn with life. I love, I slay, and am content. But also, and then unquote. So then Philalethes says, but also, how does this barbarian's view stand against the teachings of Dhamma? Well, he's more of a follower of Nietzsche, obviously. But I am impressed that Conan the Barbarian could come up with that much wisdom. I mean, this must be later on, after he became a king ruling with a troubled brow and all that. If life is an illusion, then I am no less an illusion, and being thus, the illusion is real to me. I live, I burn with life, I love, I slay, and am content. Yeah, that's pretty Nietzschean to me. That's like, revel in samsara. But at least if he knows that it's an illusion, then, I mean, if he bears that in mind, then he's got wisdom. I mean, he's sort of moving towards an enlightened point of view. So, yeah, I mean, if you are going to wallow in samsara, just like conscientiously wallow in samsara, then Conan's attitude, maybe minus the slaying part, would actually make sense. But I mean, you can do all that with a certain amount of detachment. You might not be as passionate about it. You'll be detached, but you can still participate in like ruling the kingdom and all that. Your brow wouldn't be as troubled if you did it with detachment. So you can still do the same stuff. It's just that the emphasis, or the, you know, where the center of consciousness is or whatever is different. And again, it's just this trouble people have with understanding that samsara and nibbana are not opposites. That they're just superimposed one on the other, and in a sense, they're just inseparable. So you just accept both. You know, it's like the enlightened person isn't against samsara. They just accept it without clinging to it. And I'm not sure if I answered that question either. I am impressed that Conan the Barbarian came up with some philosophy like that, though. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, have you ever traveled to Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha achieved his enlightenment? If so, do you have any travel tips? If not, then why not? Yeah, the main travel tip I would give if you go to Bodh Gaya, and I have been there. I was there like December of 1991, I think, as a junior monk at the time. Maybe 92. Yeah, December of 92. I'd been a monk for less than 2 years. And we went to the pilgrimage sites in India, the Buddhist pilgrimage sites, before I went to Burma. And I think my main advice, don't give money to the beggars until your last day. Because if you give money to the beggars, they're just going to know that you give money to beggars, and they're just going to hound you mercilessly. And I didn't have money at the time. They just kind of, sometimes they'd try to beg from me, and then I wouldn't have anything to give them. So they just kind of gave up. But I remember reading in a book a long time ago, Jack Cornfield went to Bodh Gaya, and he gave money to the beggars, you know, out of compassion. And they just pegged him. He's somebody that gives money to beggars. And he was just had flocks of beggars just hounding him everywhere he went after that. And he said it pretty much ruined his trip. At one point, at the end, he was going to take all the last rupees he had. You know, he got it all changed into small notes. He was going to have the beggars line up. He was going to give everybody, you know, the same amount. But the beggars at the end of the line started panicking, like he was going to run out before he got to them. And so they just started mobbing him. And finally, in order to just save his skin, apparently, he just wadded up the money and just threw it over their heads. And when they all turned to like pounce on the money, he took off. You know, he went a certain distance, looked, and it was just like this free-for-all going on. So, yeah, that would be one bit of advice for Bodh Gaya. Another one is just check out the Bhutanese temple. That was one of my favorite temples at Bodh Gaya, just because of the aesthetics of it. It was just really this exotic, beautiful-looking temple. And aside from that, yeah, I don't have very many travel tips. Can't remember Bodh Gaya. No, that was a different place. So yeah, I think that's my advice. So I'm just going to move on to Romeo's second question. Is visiting Bodh Gaya a sacred pilgrimage for Buddhists like Muslims traveling to Mecca? Approximately what percentage of practicing Buddhists do you estimate actually visit Bodh Gaya? So that's two questions, isn't it? I got to separate these. Okay. I'm still separating. Okay. So, first question, is visiting Bodh Gaya a sacred pilgrimage for Buddhists like Muslims traveling to Mecca? Yeah, I mean, it's not as important to Buddhists to go to Bodh Gaya as it is for Muslims to go to Mecca. But it's like the four main pilgrimage sites where the Buddha was born, which is Lumbini in Nepal, where he became enlightened, which is Bodh Gaya, where he taught the first sermon, which is at Sarnath, the deer park near Benares, and then where he died, which is, what is the name of the place where he died? I can't remember now. Gosh, I have these lapses in memory. The name of the place where the Buddha died. Yeah, it's not coming to me. Anyways, those are the four like main pilgrimage sites. You can go to lots of other places. You can go to like Vulture Peak or, Isigili Cave at the Black Rock, or you can go to, let's see, another one is Salati, like Anathapindika's Park. You can go there. And in the back of my mind, I'm still trying to remember the name of the town. It's two different names. The ancient name and the modern name are two different names. So anyways, it's like a sacred pilgrimage, but I mean, it's most Buddhists don't go to Bodh Gaya or to the other three places, which is really the next question here. Approximately what percentage of practicing Buddhists do you estimate actually visit Bodh Gaya? I guess less than 1%, because most practicing Buddhists are like Asian villagers who just don't have the means to travel to India or Nepal to go to the holy sites. So I would guess probably less than 1%, just based on the idea that, most Asian Buddhists are like villagers, they're like subsistence farmers and so forth. And most Western Buddhists probably also don't go. It might be even a higher percentage in the West, simply because we have more money, we can afford plane fare to India. But still, I'd guess less than 1% of Western Buddhists go to Bodh Gaya. I could be mistaken on that, though. It could be as high as 2%, maybe 1 out of 50. But I mean, that's still kind of pushing it. So yeah, I would say it's like a fraction of 1% of practicing Buddhists who actually go to Bodh Gaya. I was fortunate in that I was able to go, just because that's where we stopped. One of the places we stopped on our way to Burma. I was with my teacher, Paccekabuddha Sayadaw, or Taungpulu Chaltsindoya Sayadaw. He went by different names, with his retinue. And I was part of the retinue. And so we went to Japan, and then Thailand, and then India, and then back to Thailand, and finally to Burma. So I guess I answered that one. So I'm moving on to the next question, which is from GameFap. And GameFap says, any opinions on the flagrant amount of bias we see on Wikipedia? What about Rational Wiki? I see your buddy Brian gets a lot of hate on there. Yeah, with regard to Rational Wikipedia, Rational Wiki, I've seen very, very little of it. I really don't use Rational Wiki much. I remember I did kind of look up, maybe the only time I ever really spent much time on Rational Wiki was I watched a Brian Rue video where he's talking about there's these two people that are just bashing him and bashing on Rational Wiki. I think they were like, I don't know, some sort of far right kind of fundamentalist, and they considered Brian not to be far right enough, and so they were like denouncing him, or maybe they saw him as a rival or something for being the spokesman of some movement or something, and so they were just bashing away at him, which is not particularly rational. I mean, they might have bashed him in rational ways as far as I can remember, but I mean, the whole urge to bash somebody is not rational. It's not logical. But getting to Wikipedia, yeah, I mean, Wikipedia is useful for certain things like science and some like ancient history and so forth. It's actually pretty good. But I mean, like politics, for example, yeah, I mean, you have a lot of leftist activists who are just actively propagandizing on Wikipedia to the point where every once in a while they'll have like fundraising drives and, you know, they'll ask for donations. And I could not in good conscience donate, even though I use Wikipedia a lot, relatively a lot. I was looking at it earlier today about something, some family of fishes or something. But just the propaganda that they are responsible for, just it may be that the founders or like the people who are at the top running Wikipedia might not have much to do with it. It's just that the people editing, you know, they'll just edit in this propaganda stuff. Like, I think it was Stefan Molyneux. He did not have access to his own Wikipedia article, and he was blocked from his own Wikipedia article. And then the people who wrote the article were just bashing away at him. And he couldn't even defend himself. I mean, he couldn't even correct like obvious misstatements, you know, untruths in the article, that kind of stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's reprehensible. I remember reading a long time ago, it was an article, I think it was on sexual dimorphism in humans. And most of the article was fine, except somebody, like some feminist, obviously, had inserted statements into the article just completely out of context. That, for example, the fact that men have like 40% greater upper body strength than even a female athlete. Just the average guy has 40% higher upper body strength than even a female athlete. That is all caused by like patriarchy and sexual stereotypes, encouraging men to exercise and discouraging women from exercising. And I mean, that was right there in the Wikipedia article. It was just kind of obviously this insertion that somebody added, and it didn't last very long because it's such obvious bullshit. So my opinions on the flagrant amount of bias we see on Wikipedia. With regard to a lot of it, you know, you want to read about some ancient Roman emperor. I don't think the feminists or the, you know, the queer activists or that sort of people really are thorough enough to get into like a Wikipedia article on Domitian, for example. And also like the science stuff that the scientists, like you want to look up some family of fishes or some group of club mosses or some such, then I mean, most people, even most activists, they're just not qualified to add or subtract anything really. But you get into like pharmaceuticals, then, you know, you can't really trust what you read in there, because I've come across information that, you know, pharmaceutical companies are really just trying to, you know, like censor anything negative, like gnarly side effects, or it hasn't been tested fully, that kind of thing, or like shady aspects of the testing, that kind of thing. You know, that stuff, you know, gets deleted. But I've just been told that, or have read about that. So, I mean, I don't really have strong opinions about Wikipedia. I do use it regularly. I use it quite a lot. It's really good for movies. Like, you hear about a movie that might be a good movie. I mean, God King Roger Ebert is no longer with us. You can't rely on his reviews. And so sometimes I'll just look at the Wikipedia article about the movie and just go down and look at the critical response and so forth to get a good idea of whether it's going to be a good movie or not. So, yeah, I mean, that's about it. I really don't think about Wikipedia very much, even though I use it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, you said in the last show that some wars are justified. Can you list which ones you think were? It would come down to a matter of belief. The Christians thought they were justified to colonize the world because they believed that there should be no other god worshipped but theirs in the commandments. In other words, anyone who wasn't Christian was fair war. Many people believed that the Axis powers in the world wars were as justified or more than the Allied forces. And then he's got ... after this, and it may be that it keeps going. Sometimes on YouTube, in the comments, instead of show more, it'll just cut it off. So I saw this ... and when I cut and pasted the question, the ... was not it was not part of the part that was copied. So apparently YouTube, I refreshed the page and still it was the same thing. So if there's any more to this question, I didn't see it. But I guess the main question here, can you list which wars you think were justified wars? Well, just about any kind of war of self-defense. Like, just go back to ancient Rome. Look at the history of ancient Rome, and you had barbarian tribes on the other side of the Danube, on the other side of the Rhine, on the other side of like the Tigris River. They were just attacking over and over again, especially across the Danube and the Rhine. You had like on the north and like northeast of the Rhine and the Danube. You had like mainly Germanic tribes, some Sarmatian tribes, like Proto-Slavs, and also some like West Asian or East Asian nomads, Central Asian nomads that came westwards. And they are living in villages, in forests mostly. And right on the other side of the river, you've got one of the most highly advanced, richest countries to have existed. It's like the standard of living in Europe did not reach the level of the Roman Empire until late 1800s, early 1900s, especially like in England. I think it was Winston Churchill, who's very, very divisive figure nowadays. He said in his History of the English-speaking Peoples that England never got back to the standard of living they had under the Romans until the early 20th century. So you've got these barbarians that looking right across the river is just ripe for the picking. And so they were continually just invading and attacking. And in the West, and both sides of the Roman Empire, it eventually just died out just because of barbarian invasions. There was other reasons that weakened Rome so that the barbarian invasions eventually became successful. So, there was like the internal decay and all that, demoralization of the populace, so forth. Any country has the right to defend itself. If you got some other country, or not even a country, you got a barbarian horde invading your country, you have the right to defend yourself against that, especially if the barbarian horde are not peaceful and they're bearing weapons and they are killing and raping and looting. So, that would be like a really obvious example. And then, examples less obvious than that, it becomes a matter of politics. Because as I've said before, one reason why as a young man I wasn't much interested in politics is that I came to the realization that what is right and good from a political point of view is not the same as what is right and good from an ethical or moral point of view. There's some overlap, but still, war sometimes just makes perfect sense. Rome just prospered largely because of war. They became very rich just from conquering like the Dacians and the Carthaginians and so forth. It was very much to the benefit of their own people. So from a political point of view, you could say it was justified. Rome and Carthage, they had to duke it out over who was going to be the superpower of the Western Mediterranean. But when it comes to just what, like even from a moral, like a Buddhist point of view, some hardcore Buddhists would just say no war is ethical, all war is wrong, you're better off just getting killed by enemies than fighting back against them, which is one reason why Buddhism got eradicated from India when the Muslims invaded. So, it's a judgment call pretty much the whole way, I guess. If you want to be just a strict, uncompromising Buddhist saint or dogmatist, that you think it's better to die than to kill, it's better to let your family die than to harm that poor barbarian who's just trying to feed his family or just following orders or whatever, then, yeah, you're better off just renouncing the world and going off out into the forest. But I do think that, even a monk has the right to strike out in self-defense. So I do think that any country, any nation, any society is justified to fight in its own defense. But when you start getting into this country is being taken over by Marxists, it's going to fall under the Chinese or Russian sphere of influence instead of our sphere of influence. So we've got to, at the very least, get the CIA in there and stage a coup and get some lackey to our cause installed as dictator or whatever. And then, most of that is military-industrial complex making money, politicians making money as kickbacks from the military-industrial complex. The military wants to try out their new weapons, see what their new strategies and stuff, how they do. It's politics. And so, when you get to that level, when you get away from just self-preservation, or if you're just a Buddhist saint, even beyond that, then you just have to make the distinction yourself. What is justified and what is not justified. But at the very, very least, unless you're an absolute Buddhist saint that thinks it's better off that your family gets killed than that you hurt that poor barbarian, then at least wars of, defending your own borders against barbarian invasions is justified to preserve the life of the nation. So, and that wasn't any kind of veiled political commentary on what's happening now at the southern border or anything like that. It's just common sense. So, I'm just going to move on to Jodo's next question here, which is, if samsara is infinite, wouldn't it undermine the characteristic of impermanence? Well, samsara isn't the same from one moment to the next. There is no abiding spirit of samsara. It's like a human being or a flame that's different from one moment to the next. And so it's a different samsara every moment. You want to generalize that as samsara, you're putting it under this symbol, then it's going to be a little bit delusional, because samsara isn't just this one unified samsara that, that's just, it's almost like human, semantics or grammar, or just the way the human mind lumps things together and generalizes. So samsara itself is a generalization, and it is not. It is still subject to impermanence, because everything in samsara is in a state of flux. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Nature Cure. And Nature Cure says, could you please use your channel's post section for quiz purposes? Many channels do that. I will have correct answers, or it will have correct answers. So gang would gain their correct understanding through answering fun questions. Well, that's a good idea, actually. And if there's a good chance I'll eventually do that. I did have one poll on my, I've had a few polls on my Discord server. But putting in a quiz on YouTube, it's a good idea. I hadn't really thought about doing that before. So now at least I'm thinking about it. I'm not making any promises about actually doing it, but it does seem like a good idea. So I'm going to move on to the next question. This is from Robert. And Robert says, do you have any opinion on a specific Thai Buddhist interpretation of the citta? After watching a Dhamma talk by Thai monk, it seemed as though he suggested that the citta is the self because it is not contained within the five khandhas. Well, technically, from the orthodox Theravada point of view, it is contained within the five khandhas, because citta is vijnana khandha. It's consciousness. So from an orthodox point of view, it's one of the five khandhas. It's just that Thai monks, they've been influenced by Mahayana to some degree. They're not really scholars as much as the Burmese are. They're not as dogmatic. And so they've kind of drifted into an Upanishadic understanding of reality, which, the Upanishads it's not they're not foolish documents, at least the ones that are saying, the Atman is Brahman, and Brahman is just infinite formless consciousness and so forth. That's kind of the direction some of these Thai monks are going. And it's sort of a fashion in Thailand to talk about the jit or the citta as, it's essentially yourself. And some Mahayana Buddhists, there's one person on the Discord server who is a Pure Land Buddhist, and he's citing the Nirvana Sutra over and over again. And the Nirvana Sutra, apparently, I've never read it personally, but it apparently is saying essentially that nirvana is the self, or it's just like the absolute is sort of like the one self that everybody shares. It's not like everybody has an individual soul like in Christianity. Everyone shares the same soul, which is just the absolute. And I mean, that's one way of looking at it. I mean, I don't really have any argument against that other than pointing out that early Buddhism doesn't teach that, or it kind of does in a few obscure places. I've mentioned before, there are some statements in the suttas, apparently very old ones, comparing nirvana with infinite formless consciousness, or saying that the mind is bright and shining forth and it's defiled by, samsaric, extraneous things, which is a similar idea. But the thing is, it's not orthodox Theravada Buddhism. It's not so much orthodox Buddhism even, other than some schools who really do want to say that there is a self. But they can't really call it a self. They got to use some other word for it as a general rule, because it's so clear, it's just stock that there is no self in Buddhism. And so some philosophers, they'll even try to come up with, sort of ways of sneaking the self into the back door, by saying, well, there is a self, it's just not any of the five khandhas. But consciousness is one of the five khandhas, and so they have to say, well, it's a different kind of consciousness. It's not vijnana khanda, it's just vijnana something else. And I mean, in a way, they're kind of heretics, but I'm a heretic too, so I can't really bash it too much. So I'm going to move on to Robert's second question, which is, have you read The Not Self Strategy by Thanissaro Bhikkhu? And if so, what did you think of it? So that's kind of two questions, but it's the second one is the second part of this question is very short because I haven't read it. So have I read The Not Self Strategy by Thanissaro Bhikkhu? No, I haven't. And if so, what did I think of it? Well, there is no if so, because it's not. It's if not. And I mean, I am vaguely familiar with Thanissaro Bhikkhu. He is ordained in a Thai tradition. He does have respect for some of these Thai ajahns who really do say, the citta it's like who we really are. It's like the observer. It's like, it's the self, essentially. But I mean, he has to admit, he doesn't like no self. He prefers not self, because apparently he does have the door open to something other than the five khandhas being the self, even though there are suttas that call the five khandhas the all. That's it. All. That's everything. So yeah, I really do not adopt this view myself, even though if it's in the Upanishads or something, it's another way. I mean, ultimate reality, you cannot describe it in words. It's just off the scale. Anything you say about it's going to be invalid. So generally, with regard to like God or the self or whatever, you have your choice between is and isn't. And I mean, you want the tetralemma. There's is, isn't, is and isn't, neither is nor isn't. But the second two are so obscure that they're not very useful. So as a general rule, you got to say, the absolute, the ultimate is, or it isn't. And both of them are wrong. Both of them are invalid. But, I mean, the way the human mind works is you got to settle on something. And so most religions say is, and they call the ultimate God, or Brahman, or whatever. But the Buddhists, they decided on isn't. And they came to the conclusion at some point that even though isn't might be just as invalid as is, nevertheless, it's less dangerous. You're less likely to cling to samsara with isn't than with is. But it's off the scale. Is and isn't are both wrong. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Outer Haven. And we've been going at this for almost 2 hours. I still don't know how close I am to the bottom because the little thingy on the side doesn't indicate correctly. So Outer Haven says, why do so many perverts try to start their own religious movements? And then he's got this list. Maybe I shouldn't read it, but I don't know. Freedom of speech or something. His list of examples are Muhammad, Joseph Smith, Rasputin, Koresh, and Jim Jones. And then he said, Buddha and Jesus seem to be the few exceptions. So why do so many perverts try to start their own religious movements? Well, they're not necessarily perverts to begin with. Some of them, I mean, some of the lower level cult members, they want to be a cult leader just because they want first pick of all the pretty girls who are attracted to the cult. I mean, there are some like that, I suppose. But then some people, they don't start off as, it's not even, I don't know if it's even right to call them perverts, some of these people. Not all of them are perverts, but like Koresh, he was a polygamist. I don't think he was messing around with children or animals or anything like that. I don't think he had a foot fetish or anything. So, Muhammad was just a product of his time. He married Aisha when she was 9, but I think he waited till she was 11, which is probably when she started menstruating, started the transition into becoming a biological adult, that he consummated the marriage. Let's see. Why do they try to start their own religious movements? Some of them, I assume, are just sincere. They start this religious movement. They are inspired somehow or other. And then it just turns out that they're seen as just the greatest guy in the world by all these young women. And so if they're just falling into their lap like ripe fruit, then they go for it because they're human. So I assume that is the case with some of these, that they didn't start off as perverts just trying to start their own religious movement so that they can perv more easily. That some of them were just well-intentioned and maybe a little nutty, maybe a little hysterical or something, but still, all of a sudden, even though women wouldn't look at them twice before, now that they're the leader of this new religious movement, it's like women with stars in their eyes are just like falling all over themselves to just do anything they can for them. And so it's relatively rare man who could resist that for very long, I think. Buddha and Jesus seem to be the few exceptions. Yeah, I'm sure there's more exceptions than that. There were a lot of founders of schools of Hindu philosophy and so forth that, I assume that they remain saintly. So I guess I answered that question. So I'm moving on to the next question, which is from Twin Wasabi. And Twin Wasabi says, what is your opinion on new atheists like Richard Dawkins? He's an intelligent man, but his enormous ego prevents him from stepping outside his self-imposed box. I saw in an interview he even admitted that no amount of evidence would convince him of any deity or supernatural phenomenon. What kind of scientist says that no evidence would convince them? Yeah, he's extremely smug. That's the word that I would use for him. He's also got a huge ego, but he's smug. And he's not entirely operating in good faith. Like, I did read the Science Delusion by Rupert Sheldrake, who mentions in his book about how he got invited to be on a documentary with Richard Dawkins. And the whole thing was a setup. It was sort of like the Trump's debate with Kamala Harris. The whole thing was kind of a setup where they were going to make him look like a fool. And Richard Dawkins, he was just kind of shameless about it. It's like the whole point of the documentary was to make anyone who disagrees with orthodox mainstream science look like a crackpot and a fool. So, yeah, I'm not sure about if he says that no evidence can convince him. That's strange because, like parapsychology is also science. So, he would be even against some kinds of science. He's like the amazing Randy. He's just mainstream materialistic science, and even controversial scientific fields like parapsychology. He's just going to say it's all bullshit. I'm not paying any attention to it. Or if I do pay attention to it, I'm just going to mock and sneer at it. And a lot of atheists are like this. Just their new religion is atheism or scientific materialism. Scientific realism is essentially their religion, and they have like this faith-based attitude towards it, and they just reject that science has any articles of faith, which it certainly does. I used to bash away at scientism, and I've written a number of essays just pointing out that scientism or scientific realism, taken as an interpretation of reality, it's more sophisticated than most mainstream religion with regard to its articles of faith, but still it's got articles of faith. Like it's belief that there's like this phenomenal world going on out there, even if there's no mind to perceive it. They have no way of proving that. They might be able to produce some kind of evidence that's good enough for them. Or just even like this gray blob of meat with the consistency of an overripe avocado inside our skull has the capacity to understand reality. They just take that as a matter of faith. And some of them, like Dawkins, are extremely smug about it. So, yeah, the new atheist is, it's essentially scientific materialism turned into a religion, as far as I can tell. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Master Poe. And Master Poe says, you're in a checkout line in a grocery store. All of a sudden, without warning, flatulence occurs. And for those of you who are not very good at 3-syllable words, it means somebody farted. I guess somebody also has 3 syllables, so you're still in the dark, I guess. Okay, I'll just start over. Master Poe says, you're in a checkout line in a grocery store. All of a sudden, without warning, flatulence occurs by you and your wife is standing next to you. Are you embarrassed? Well, no, I wouldn't be embarrassed because, let's face it, everyone knows women don't fart. I wasn't born yesterday. They don't fart and they don't take dumps. That's a guy thing. So I'd probably just glare at the nearest guy in line. So in that case, I'm not sure if I'd be embarrassed or not. Sometimes people ask questions, not necessarily of me, but like in politics or something, what would you do if this happened? And sometimes you don't know how you're going to react in a situation you've never reacted to before. It's just going to be something comes up from inside, something nonverbal. And I got distracted. It looked like somebody was outside the window. So let's see. Yeah, you don't know exactly how you're going to react or what's going to happen, whether I'd be embarrassed or not. I'm not exactly sure. Let's see. So I guess I answered that question. I'm going to move on to Master Poe's next question. Would an enlightened being be embarrassed? Well, it's just kind of a strange question to ask if an enlightened being would be embarrassed if a woman farted, because, like I just pointed out, women don't fart. I did hear a Burmese nun make a sound like she was farting once. So, possibly, she kind of stopped being feminine enough because she was sort of, shaving her head and becoming a nun and all that. It might be possible then. So would an enlightened being be embarrassed? And again, maybe at the superficial level, just human nature taking its course past karma, which even enlightened beings allegedly have, might just cause this reaction to occur spontaneously, except the enlightened being would not be like living at that level. It would just be nature taking its course, which is one reason why it's hard to evaluate claims that such and such person is enlightened. For me, anyway. In Orthodox Theravada, in order to be fully enlightened, you've got to be an absolutely perfect saint. You can't do anything wrong. You can't even want to do anything wrong. You are just absolutely perfected saint in an ethical sense. And I'm not so sure that that's the case, personally. So would an enlightened being be embarrassed? Probably not. But even if they did show some signs of embarrassment, it may be. If they were fully enlightened, it would just be nature taking its course, just a natural human reaction. But they're not at that level. That's just one of an infinite number of levels that they have access to. And I hope I answered that one because I'm moving on to the next one. This is from Cleefy. Cleefy says, is a mental crisis an inseparable part on the way to nirvana? And I've mentioned before that Ram Dass made a statement in one of his early books that haunted me throughout much of my life. And that was that it's the absolute despair, or despair is an absolute prerequisite of significant spiritual growth. And in my case, it seems to have been borne out that the main spiritual growth spurts in my life have been results of despair. Just you hit this crisis, you hit this wall, you don't know how to deal with it. And there is a book, Battle for the Mind by William Sargent, which maybe I should take to that desert island. It's based on the idea that we vertebrates, including Pavlov's dogs, we're governed by habit. It's just like Schopenhauer was saying earlier, a person, they're exposed to the same stimulus, they're going to react the same way so long as their personality remains the same, their way of perceiving things remain the same. So what happens is we just get locked in to this habit pattern. And even if it doesn't make us happy, so long as it keeps us alive, so long as it keeps us going through life, we just cling to that. We could be miserable. We could have all kinds of bad habits, but so long as it has succeeded in keeping us alive well enough, then we just cling to it. And it takes some kind of crisis where our habitual way of dealing with things just cannot cope with it anymore. It's just, your mind just breaks down. That's how Chinese brainwashing worked. That's how a lot of religious indoctrination works. Like the early Methodists were like this. It's like how, like in Stalinist Soviet Union, how the interrogation procedures work, where not only would they get you to confess to trying to overthrow the government, they'd get you to actually believe that you were trying to overthrow the government. It's how a lot of like military basic training works, where they just break you down into a quivering mass of jelly and then build you back up into a fighting machine that will not question an order. That's how a lot of manhood rituals work, like in pre-modern societies. So I don't think it's necessary for everybody to have this kind of crisis and breakdown in order to just break through into a new level, a higher, better level, hopefully, unless you've got the Chinese commissar who's there indoctrinating you into being a communist. So in the text themselves, the Pali text, they do say that there's 4 ways of making spiritual progress. There's slow and painful, slow and pleasant, fast and painful, and fast and pleasant. So it may be that if you're in the pleasant side of the equation, that you had your crises and your like despair in a previous existence, and you don't need that anymore. But somewhere along the line, it may be necessary. And Ram Dass said it was a absolute prerequisite to significant spiritual growth that you are going to have despair, because that's what breaks the shell and allows you to form a newer, better, bigger shell, which eventually also is going to have to break. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question, because we've already been going for over 2 hours here. I'm not exactly sure how far down the list I've gotten. So the next question is from Yuga-U. And Yuga-U says, not much to ask today about how are you? Well, I'm fine, thank you. I remember when I was a little kid, I used to hate it when grown-ups would ask me how I was, because I was told by my mother, when someone asks how you are, you say, I'm fine. But when I was a little kid, I didn't know what the word fine meant. So it just kind of bothered me. I had to keep saying that I was fine when I didn't even know what it meant. But let's see, how am I? I mean, there's stuff going on. It's like if you're in a relationship, I've mentioned this before, it's more of a roller coaster ride than being a monk. If you're a monk, you're going for like neutral, smooth sailing. You got more calm seas. But if you're in a relationship, there's more positive and more negative. It's just the way it has to be, apparently. So there's that. Also at work, I mean, we've been going through a troubled time at work. I was just wiped out when I came home from work yesterday. I've been wiped out most of this week, partly because the manager he was offered a job that paid like twice as much money. He moved on. We don't have a manager, and it's taken the corporate, it's taken them relatively forever to get us a new manager, and we're just completely understaffed. There's a couple other people also left recently just because they got a better offer somewhere, or one person, she just hated working there. And so, I mean, we're trying to get by on barely a skeleton crew, and it's just sort of chaotic because nobody is really experienced at being a manager, and somebody's got to do the manager stuff. So right now we've got like the warehouse coordinator, the guy who's like overseeing, like the foreman of the sheet metal shop, like the production side of it. He's doing most of that, and I mean, he's stressed out, and just it's stressful. It's not easy. So, yeah, I mean, there's more positive and more negative now that I am not a monk anymore. Let's see. So, Yuga says, do you like your non-monk life? I have no regrets, really. I think it's just the thing I should have done. And yeah, I mean, I like my non-monk life for the most part. I mean, you have bad days sometimes, but for the most part, yeah, I do like it. And I certainly have no regrets. So, I'm going to move on to Yuga U's third question, which is, read any good book or seen a good movie lately? And I haven't been reading many books or watching movies much lately, which is very different from the way I used to be just like 5-10 years ago. Well, when I was in America anyway. Well, I read lots of books in Burma, watched more movies when I was in America. But I did watch the second Dune movie. Dune Part 2, I guess it's called. That was a fairly good movie. It was approximately as good as the first movie. So, yeah, I haven't read hardly any books at all lately. And that's like the only good movie that I can think of. I think it qualifies as a good movie. So there you are. And I'm moving on to the next question. I do appreciate easy questions sometimes. So, this is from Raphael. And Raphael says, one rule I don't understand is that you need your parents' permission to become a monk. Is there only the option of behaving like Ratapala and threatening suicide by fasting to eventually get your parents' permission if they are stubborn? Well, that's not the only option. Like I mentioned before, a few Q&As back, I did have a friend who was ordained without his parents' permission. Both of his parents were devout Christians. They did not consent to him becoming a Buddhist monk. And so he was ordained under Tampulu Sayadaw himself, the founder of the tradition, which I was ordained. And they ordained him anyway, even though he didn't have his parents' permission, because if you don't have your parents' permission and they ordain you, it's still a valid ordination. Unlike some, if you're lacking in certain qualities, then no, it's not a valid ordination. But if your parents don't consent, that if you get ordained, it's still a valid ordination. You're still an ordained monk. It's just that the monks who ordained you have committed a dukkha offense, which is a relatively minor offense. And so Tampulu Sayadaw told him that the Sangha is willing to make the sacrifice by ordaining him and committing this offense, which they then had to confess to some other monk to expiate the offense. So that would be the two main ways of going about it. Either just hold your breath till you turn blue, threaten suicide or something until your parents under duress give permission, or just go ahead and get ordained without their permission, which is against a minor rule, but still you would be a validly ordained monk. Unlike, like, for example, a trans man ordaining as a monk, that even if the monks ordain this person still would not be an ordained monk, because you have to have a full, at least one kahone, biological kahone. You have to be a biological male and not a eunuch. Even eunuchs can't be ordained. So let's say there's a eunuch, a castrated male wants to be ordained. Even if they ordain him, it's not a valid ordination. He's still just a lay person. So, I guess I answered that one. I'm moving on to the next one. This is from Not a Canadian. And Not a Canadian says, did you have a midlife crisis? Well, I did have a crisis like when I was, about 40, I guess. But whether it was a midlife crisis or not, I don't know. 40 is kind of the middle of the average person's life, I guess. So, yeah, but it wasn't being middle-aged as far as I know that caused it. It was something else that caused it. I was living in a cave in Burma. I'd been a monk for like 10 years. So I'd be only 37, 38 years old. Yeah, I don't think that would be a midlife crisis. If you have a crisis when you're like 38. Huh. So maybe I didn't. But I did have that one crisis. It was like the last time I ever got really depressed. And it was, I've described it before. I had some kind of fever, which just ruined everything. I couldn't meditate, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't bathe. I just hit rock bottom. Like all comforts were deprived. I was deprived of all comfort and consolation, essentially. And so it just triggered this depression, just thinking I've been a monk for more than 10 years. And it's like, if I can still hit rock bottom like this, it's just futile. It's just hopeless. And so that's when I just kind of gave up. And it was right after I gave up that I just had this spiritual growth spurt. It was like despair resulting in significant spiritual growth, apparently. But whether that was a midlife crisis or not, I didn't buy like a red convertible or anything. So I think I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Not a Canadian. If I would not be reborn, then whoever will be reborn, it won't be me. So why care? Well, you don't really exist even now. You're not the same you from one moment to the next. So, why bother? If it's not even you can just hit yourself in the foot with a hammer or something. It's not going to be you, it's going to be somebody else. So it's not like in Buddhism you try to eliminate the self in order to become enlightened, because the self isn't real to begin with. So, or on the other hand, you can just have compassion for whoever is going to be caused by your existence. Sort of like you'd have compassion towards your own children. So, that would be another reason right there. Even if you think that there's not going to be any kind of connection at all between you and who you're going to be reborn as. But, you don't exist even now in reality. There is no you in ultimate reality. And so there is going to be no almost you in the next life. But, if you can be indifferent towards what happens to you, if you don't care if you go to hell, then, you may not care if whoever comes after you who is similar to you has the same karma as you. A lot of this, essentially the same strengths and weaknesses as you. I guess you wouldn't care about that either. It's sort of like devil worshippers. Like real devil worshippers, not like just the ones who are atheists who just call themselves Satanists but don't really believe in Satan. But there are some people who really do try to sell their soul to the devil. And it's kind of the same thing. It's like, I want good stuff now, even though I'm sending my future self into hell. That's just ridiculous. That's so foolish. It's like you don't care. Even not only do you not care about others, you don't even care about your future self. Although ultimately there is no self, but like Conan was saying, if it's all an illusion and myself also is an illusion, it's real to me. So until you can get to the point of just being indifferent whether you go to heaven or hell, then even though you don't really exist, you're still probably better off doing good instead of bad. And I'm not 100% sure that I answered that question. Or maybe at least not answered it in the vein that Not a Canadian wanted it to be answered. Let's see, if I would not be reborn, then whoever will be reborn, it won't be me. So why care? Yeah, well, it's going to be, I mean, it's not going to be the same you. I mean, there is no you to begin with, but I mean, you're different from one moment to the next. And so, I mean, it's the same kind of a deal. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is also from Not a Canadian. Did you have a mental existential trouble when switching caves and other places to live? Not really. I mean, I had a little bit of existential trouble when I first came back to America in 2011 when I was still a monk. And I literally didn't know where I was going to sleep that night. I was just so fed up with being stuck in Burma that I'm going for it. I'm just doing it. I'm going to America. Wasn't sure who was going to pick me up at the airport. I just sent out this announcement saying, I'm going to be there. Anyone who wants to pick me up can do it because I'm coming. And that was, I mean, it took a certain amount of courage, I guess. And there was a certain amount of trepidation, like, what the hell am I getting myself into? But I'm just doing it. You know, it's sort of like entering the battlefield almost. But just like in Burma, moving from one cave to the next or something, I mean, there might be a certain amount of nervousness or something just associated with that, but it wasn't really anything major. Certainly nothing that would give me enough like anxiety that I'd be thinking, do I really want to do this? Do I really want to move into that forest? I really wanted to. So it just seemed like the thing to do at the time. So I did it. So yeah, probably the only time that I had real existential trouble when switching places to live as a monk was that big move I made in 2011, where I was just going to try and be a free range monk in America, not living in a monastery, just landing there and letting Dhamma take care of me, which it kind of did. It did. I mean, Christianity says the same thing. Buddhism says the same thing, you know, give no thought for tomorrow, what you will eat or where you will sleep, that kind of thing. If you really take it seriously, it's true that Dharma or whatever, I mean, you get what you need. You might not get much more than that. You might just be like really living from hand to mouth, but it did work, sort of. Kind of. I did eventually go back to Burma though, because it wasn't working well enough. I was being supported by so few people that I felt like I was a burden on these few people. And it was just America, the attitude, like even some of my main supporters, why don't you just drop out and get a job? They just did not get it. You know, they didn't really understand the whole dynamic of monks and lay people and all that. They just called themselves Sangha and consider that to be good enough. Some people, not my supporters, but other people like in the same like Dhamma group, you know, they were just kind of resentful of the very existence of a monk. You know, it's like I was just wearing robes to put myself above them or something, as though their own lukewarm mediocrity in Dhamma wasn't good enough somehow. So I just kind of deviated from answering that question, which I think is already pretty much answered. So I'm going to move to the next question, which sort of is from Not a Canadian, except he blames his fiancée, Avenity. So let's just attribute it to Avenity. So that way we get away from the transgressive fourth question. Oh, and I didn't do it. I'm not going to be able to answer this question anyway, I guess. Please listen to 9 Inch Nails Every Day is Exactly the Same with lyrics and tell me what you think about it. And I didn't do it. Damn. Maybe I can just answer this one in the comments below after I watch the video. Yeah, it totally spaced this one off. I mean, 9 Inch Nails, I don't know, they have sort of like a really dark, at least the few songs that I've listened to have like this dark, cynical, semi-satanic kind of approach to their lyrics that I don't really appreciate. But who knows? It's not a representative sample. It might not be statistically significant. But yeah, I do apologize for not having listened to 9 Inch Nails Every Day is Exactly the Same. But I'll get to it, I guess. So I'm just going to have to move on to the next one with all due respects to Not a Canadian who asked the transgressive fourth question anyway. This is from Drunk Druck. And Drunk Druck says, have you noticed that World War II mythology has become the prime symbolic religion in the West since the 50s? Tucker Carlson had on a historian who holds contrarian views about the war. This immediately infuriated a horde of establishment experts like ants coming out of a hill. Few subjects are as sacred as World War II, which is why the establishment furiously protects its image. I know you read A.J.P. Taylor's book, Origins of the Second World War, which was also controversial. Why is the orthodox view of World War II so protected? Well, first of all, I don't think that World War II mythology really has become the prime symbolic religion in the West. I mean, you've got scientific materialism like Dawkins, who, that's more of a religious thing than the established narrative about World War II. Rather than World War II mythology, let's just call it the established narrative. And, nowadays people are just kind of ignorant of World War II. Most people really don't know that much about it. I guess that the average American couldn't name more than 3 countries that fought on the Axis side. They wouldn't know like the major battles or anything like that. They wouldn't really know how it happened. They just know that World War II happened, like Adolf Hitler started conquering Europe and killing Jews. And so all these other countries had to fight against him to keep him from taking over the world and killing off all the Jews. That's essentially World War II in a nutshell, for the average normie, I guess. So let's see here. Why is the Orthodox view of World War II so protected? Well, partly, it is true. The German National Socialists killed a lot of Jews. And so Jews, Hebrews, maybe I should say, they don't want to see Adolf Hitler humanized in any way, that he's just the evilest person to exist. Largely because of this established narrative. Adolf Hitler, if I mentioned this before, that if there was a poll, people were asked, who is the evilest person who ever existed? I would guess Adolf Hitler would wind up at the top of the list, even though there's worse people than him. Stalin killed more people than Hitler did. Mao killed more people than Stalin and Hitler combined. Pol Pot was no angel either. Worse than Hitler, in my opinion, although he may have caused less damage because he was mainly just killing Cambodians. So, let's see. Why is the Orthodox view of World War II so protected? It's just they're just invested in it now. Even setting aside the Hebrew aspect, you've got, nationalism. You've got, it's hard to say. It's just the establishment set up this narrative. This is the established narrative, so it can't really be changed very much. There might be a little bit of tweaking, but it can't just be overthrown, because it would just discredit pretty much everybody who has been invested in establishing this established narrative. And of course, we're the good guys. Our side is the good guys, and we should have won, and so we did. So, anything that challenges that, unless maybe you've got, even leftists can't say that we weren't the good guys. Generally they say America is evil, we're the bad guys, but, at least we had the Soviet Union on our side. They were one of the allies, and we were going against Nazis, and not everyone knows Nazis are totally evil, even though communists are considered to be okay. Even though the communists kill more people than the fascists did. So I guess that's the main reason, is just the Hebrew aspect of not wanting to make somebody who was responsible for the death of lots and lots of Hebrew people to somehow reclaim him, or rehumanize him. And then also it's just we're the good guys. This is the established narrative, and you don't want to overthrow that. It's just unnecessary rocking the boat. Although Nowadays, you can go back to ancient Rome and say, well, Domitian probably wasn't really persecuting Christians like the Christians were saying that he was persecuting them, or such and such emperor probably wasn't really the psychopathic monster he is portrayed because he was of foreign extraction, or he was of the lower classes, and the patricians who were writing the chronicles hated his guts pretty much like the establishment hates Donald Trump's guts, and so they're just spewing all the bad stuff they can say about him, even though a lot of it might be completely groundless. But I'm just completely deviating, digressing, and just making my best guess to Drunk Druck's question. And so I'm just moving on to the next question. This is from Elias. And we are getting close to the bottom. This is the second to last question. All of a sudden, boom. Anyways, Elias says, although it is unlikely that God or Amitabha exists, the thought of laying my destiny into the hands of an external being is very tempting. Why are we humans like that? And what is the cure for this phenomena? He says phenomena, which is plural. It should be phenomenon. Or it would be, what is the cure for these phenomena? So anyways, Elias is mainly asking, why, why do we want to put our destiny into the hands of an external being, which might just be mythological? Well, it's part of human nature. I think some of it is just sort of like infantile instincts, like instincts from childhood where you feel very safe and protected with a parent, with your dad or your mom. They're big and powerful and they look after you and they feed you and keep you safe and everything. And these instincts, to some degree, remain with us through life. And it could be, to some degree, we've got it has transmogrified into a kind of political instinct where we just obey the leader and follow orders and so forth. Like some people just glorify certain political leaders. Some people think Trump is essentially God's chosen, who's been chosen by God to save America, that kind of thing. Also, just the whole guru thing, just sort of surrendering yourself to a guru and just like unquestioning obedience. It is part of human nature. It's like possibly it didn't happen to us until we became a domesticated animal. When we were still relatively wild hunter-gatherers, we may not have been so just programmed to obey the chief the way we are now. But I do think it's just lack of self-confidence would be another aspect of it, where a lot of people, they're obviously not happy. Nobody's completely happy. That's the first noble truth of Buddhism. And so they just get this idea that, if only God will protect me or something, or Apollo, Athena, Osho, Donald Trump, if they'll, they'll protect me. And so, I just throw myself at their feet, kind of a thing. So there's different reasons. I assume different people have different reasons for it. With some people, it could just be like the childlike, infantile desire for a parent figure to protect them. In others, it could just be like the domesticated animal of obeying the leader. There's a lot of that in the human race. Most people are followers. They want somebody to follow. They might choose the best person to follow, and then they just follow them. The Roman Empire was like that. You might be choosing like a ruthless psychopath to be the emperor, the next emperor, but he's a damn good general, and there's going to be relative prosperity, even though he might be purging some senators and so forth. So, I assume there's various reasons for it, but it does seem to be human nature that most people, I'm really not a follower. I may not be much of a leader, but I'm not much of a follower either. And so, I've been kind of a loner throughout most of my life. But I think most people just are programmed to be followers. And largely, it's just lack of enough vision or intelligence or drive or whatever to really get their own life worked out and know what direction they should go. So they just pick someone to decide for them. And that's one reason why people are such sheeple and just believe what they're told by mainstream media, even though mainstream media is just like blatant, shameless propagandist liars now. So, yeah, it's a tough question, and I can't really give an authoritative answer on it, although I just kind of threw some ideas at it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. And this is from Fred, and this is the last question. And Fred says, is Nirodha Samapati the same as being knocked out and recovering consciousness? So he's Nirodha Samapati, or the attainment of cessation. Or in longer form, it's the attainment of cessation of, let's see, perception and feeling. So, Sanya Vedana Nirodha. Yeah, I think that's it. So it's the cessation of perception and feeling. And according to Orthodox Theravada, this Nirodha Samapati, or the cessation of perception and feeling, is just a state of suspended animation. You're essentially in a temporary coma. Because Orthodox Theravada came up with this idea that you cannot have consciousness without perception and feeling. So if you get rid of the perception and feeling, you got to get rid of the consciousness too. So, I mean, that's it. I mean, you're just in the state of suspended animation. Only a very highly advanced saint can attain this stage, which is strange. That why would anyone want to attain it? Because you wouldn't even be aware of having attained it, because there's no awareness, there's no consciousness. It's just like being in a coma. As soon as you come out of it, the last thing you remember was going into it, because you can't remember what was going on when your mind was not functioning. So I think this is just a case of Orthodox Theravada coming up with this idea that you cannot have pure consciousness without an object. There always has to be consciousness of something. So you get rid of the something that there's consciousness of, you get rid of the consciousness. And I don't think that originally it was that way. I already mentioned, there are a few suttas that imply that nibbana is infinite formless consciousness. And also you got these Thai ajahns talking about the jit, or the chitta, that is sort of like this self in an Upanishadic sense. So it could be that there was something like that. It's just off the scale though. And that's the problem. You can't really nail it down. Yes is invalid, no is invalid. Yes and no is invalid. Neither yes nor no is invalid, because it's just off the scale. Once you put it into words, once you put it into concepts, you've lost it. You just have to be aware of it directly. And that's mysticism, which somebody like Richard Dawkins would just sneer at. But that's the only way of really understanding reality, is to understand it directly without coming up with thoughts and symbols for describing it, because you're going to fail. It just doesn't work that way. So it could be that there was a state of Nirodha Samapati, which was the cessation of perception and feeling, that you could attain and you remain conscious while you were doing it. It would be like fourth jhana, or fourth jhana, like the highest of the formless jhanas is the realm of neither perception nor non-perception. So the next stage would just be non-perception. But Orthodox Theravada says if you reach non-perception, you're not conscious anymore. It's just nothing. You're in a temporary coma. There is no experience, no awareness at all. But I do think it's possible that you can have consciousness that does not have an object. That's unorthodox heresy. But still, there are a few verses, at least in the text, that say this. But the thing is, again, once you reach that stage, it's off the scale, and anything you say about it is going to be invalid. So there's really no point in arguing much about it, maybe just for fun. And that's it. And that is it for the Q&A too. So if you have any questions you think I might be able to answer about Buddhism, philosophy, meditation, monasticism, Burma, me personally, etc., feel free to leave them in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you have not done so already. And be happy.